The room smelled like money and failure. Victoria Ashford, 30 years old, worth more than most small countries, the kind of woman whose name made investors stand up straighter, was staring at a $5 million hypercar that wouldn't start. Her best engineers had spent 4 days tearing it apart and putting it back together. Nothing worked. Then a man walked through her doors in a faded jacket and scuffed boots, set an old toolbox on her polished floor, and asked for $899 to look at it. She laughed at him. That was her first mistake, and far from her last. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next will genuinely surprise you. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The hypercar had no name yet. That was intentional. Victoria Ashford believed that a machine of this magnitude deserved to arrive in the world on its own terms, without a label attached before people had a chance to see it move, hear it breathe, feel the particular violence of its acceleration pressing them back into their seats. The naming ceremony was supposed to happen at the global unveiling, a ticketed event, invite only, with journalists flown in from 12 countries and a guest list that read like the index of a Forbes issue. 6 weeks of preparation. 3 months of media silence designed to build maximum pressure behind the announcement. All of it now sat balanced on the edge of a very expensive catastrophe. The engineering bay at Ashford Motors' flagship facility outside Sacramento was the kind of space that felt more like a cathedral than a workplace. 40-foot ceilings, climate-controlled air that cost more to maintain per month than most people earned in a year. The floor was a pale gray epoxy so clean you could eat off it, though nobody ever did, because the culture of the facility did not permit that kind of informality. Everything here was precise. Everything was controlled. Victoria had designed it that way deliberately because she believed that the environment a team worked in was a direct reflection of the quality they were capable of producing, which made the silence around the hypercar feel like a personal insult. It sat in the center of the bay on a raised platform surrounded by diagnostic equipment, monitor banks, and approximately 14 engineers who were doing an increasingly convincing impression of people who had no idea what they were looking at. The car itself was extraordinary, even in stillness. A low, aggressive silhouette with bodywork that seemed to shift color depending on the angle of the light. Carbon fiber panels so precisely fitted you could barely see the seams. It was a masterpiece of engineering, design, and about 4 years of continuous development work. It was also completely dead. 4 days. That's how long the team had been at it. The failure had appeared without warning during what should have been a routine pre-delivery systems check. The engine turned over, caught for approximately 3 seconds, and then simply stopped. Every attempt to restart it after that had produced nothing. No error code that made sense, no obvious physical damage, no component that was visibly wrong. It was as if the car had simply decided it was done. "Walk me through it again," Victoria said. She was standing at the edge of the platform, arms crossed, wearing a white blazer over a dark shirt, her dark hair pulled back in a way that looked effortless, but wasn't. She had the kind of face that photographs well under pressure, controlled, composed, all angles and certainty. At 30, she had spent the better part of a decade cultivating the image of someone who was never rattled, and she was very good at it. Marcus Webb, her head of engineering, 46, perpetually exhausted, currently looking like a man who had not slept in 2 of the 4 days in question, pulled up a tablet and began talking. "We've replaced the primary ECU, both secondary control modules, the ignition relay harness, the fuel delivery sensors, and 3 components in the engine management array," he said. "We've run 47 full diagnostic cycles. We've had 2 consultants on the phone from the transmission supplier in Stuttgart and 1 from the battery management company in Seoul. Nobody has been able to..." "What's the current theory?" Marcus paused. It was a very small pause, but Victoria caught it. "Marcus, we don't have a confirmed theory at this time." Victoria looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the car. Then she looked at the 12 other engineers in the bay, none of whom appeared eager to make eye contact with her. 47 diagnostics, she said. "Yes. And you don't have a theory. We have several working hypotheses, but nothing we've been able to..." "Cancel the working hypotheses," she said. "Give me a solution." She walked out of the bay before anyone could answer, because she didn't want them to see her press her fingers against her temple for 3 seconds in the hallway, which was the closest she ever came in professional settings to showing that something had gotten to her. It had gotten to her. Bob. The call from Raymond Chu came that evening, while Victoria was in her office on the top floor of the administrative building, reviewing the updated investor timeline she'd had her assistant prepare. A politely worded document that was, in essence, a detailed accounting of how badly a delay would damage the company's position with the 3 institutional investors they were currently courting. Raymond was not on her normal contact list, but he was the kind of person who tended to find his way through to people regardless. He was a semi-retired consultant who had worked around the automotive industry for 30 years, knew everybody, and had the particular talent of being on the right side of useful at exactly the moments when useful was what you needed. "I heard you have a problem," he said, without preamble. "I have a situation," Victoria said. "Right. I heard about your situation. Listen, I know a guy. Raymond, my engineering division has 42 people with combined credentials that—" "I know a guy," Raymond repeated, as if she hadn't spoken. "He's not going to look the way you expect. That's important for me to tell you up front, because I know you, and I know you're going to form a judgment in the first 30 seconds, and I'm asking you not to do that." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Who is he?" "His name is Ethan Cole. He runs a small garage out past Roseville, an independent operation, 1 lift. The whole thing looks like it belongs in a different decade. He's 32. He's got a kid, raises her on his own, keeps to himself." "That's not a resume." "No," Raymond agreed, "but he's the best diagnostician I have ever personally seen work on an advanced engine system. I'm not talking good for a small garage. I'm talking better than anyone I've seen anywhere, including in facilities considerably more impressive than yours." Victoria looked at the investor document on her desk. "Fine. Get him in here tomorrow morning." "Oh." Ethan Cole arrived at 8:14, which was 14 minutes late, which was not a strong opening. He drove up in a truck that was somewhere around 15 years old, clean, but visibly used in the way that working vehicles get used, with small dings in the bed and a windshield with a repaired chip in the lower corner. He parked it in the visitor lot without any apparent awareness of the fact that it was surrounded by vehicles worth 10 to 20 times what it had probably cost new. Victoria watched from the second-floor window of the administrative building as he got out. He was medium height, medium build, the kind of person you could pass in a grocery store and not notice. He was wearing a jacket that had clearly been a decent jacket a number of years ago and had since been washed enough times that the color had settled somewhere between navy and gray. He reached into the truck bed and pulled out a toolbox. Not a rolling professional unit with multiple drawers and a foam-lined interior, but an old metal box with a handle, the kind of thing that looked like it had been inherited rather than purchased. He stood in the parking lot for a moment, looked up at the building, and then walked toward the entrance without hurrying. "That's him?" said Renata, Victoria's executive assistant, from somewhere behind her right shoulder. "Apparently. He looks like he's here to fix the break room refrigerator." Victoria didn't respond to that, which was not the same as disagreeing with it. They brought him to the engineering bay, and Victoria watched from just inside the doorway as Ethan walked slowly around the hypercar. He didn't touch it right away. He just looked at it, moving around the perimeter of the platform with his toolbox at his side and his eyes moving in a way that was slightly difficult to describe. Not scanning, exactly, more like reading. As if the machine was a text and he was working through it at his own pace. The assembled engineers watched him with expressions ranging from politely skeptical to barely concealed disdain. Marcus Webb stood with his tablet, visibly uncertain of the appropriate professional posture for this particular situation. Damian Cross, the company's chief technical officer, stood near the back of the group with his arms folded. He was 51, silver-haired, impeccably dressed in the way that technical executives at well-funded companies sometimes were, projecting competence through grooming and tailoring in a way that substituted for actually being the smartest person in the room. He had said nothing on the walk down from the briefing room, and he said nothing now. He just watched Ethan the way a man watches something he doesn't think is a threat, but would prefer to have stay at a distance anyway. Ethan crouched down beside the driver's side and looked at something near the front wheel well. Then he stood up. Then he walked around to the engine compartment, which had been left accessible after the most recent round of diagnostic work, and he looked at the interior of it for about 45 seconds without touching anything. Then he picked up a device from his toolbox, connected it to the diagnostic port, and watched the readout for about 2 minutes. Then he disconnected it, put it back in the toolbox, and stood up. "I can tell you what's wrong with it," he said. The room was quiet. "Okay," Victoria said. "Tell me." "My diagnostic fee is $899. The silence that followed was a very specific kind of silence, the kind that happens when a group of people all experience the same thought at the same time and are deciding simultaneously whether it's appropriate to express it out loud. Victoria heard, from somewhere to her left, a very small sound that was the beginning of a laugh that got suppressed. She looked at Ethan. He was looking back at her with an expression she found difficult to categorize. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't apologetic. It was simply patient, like someone who has asked a reasonable question and is willing to wait a reasonable amount of time for an answer. $899, she repeated. Yes. For a diagnostic fee. That's what I charge. She looked at Marcus, who raised his eyebrows slightly in a way that communicated that he was choosing to have no opinion on this. She looked at the car. She looked back at Ethan. We have spent, she said, keeping her voice very even, significantly more than $899 attempting to diagnose this vehicle already. We have some of the most credentialed engineers in the industry working on it. And you're telling me that you walked around the car for 5 minutes, looked at a readout, and now you want $899 to tell me what's wrong with it. I've been walking around it for 11 minutes, Ethan said. And yes. Someone to her left actually laughed this time. A short, involuntary sound quickly covered with a cough. Victoria felt something tighten in her chest. Not anger exactly, something more like the particular irritation of a person who is very good at reading rooms and is currently being presented with someone who appears entirely unbothered by the room. I think, she said carefully, that you should consider the position you're in. You're standing in a facility that generates more revenue in a single quarter than your business will likely see in its entire operational lifetime. We are not going to pay a small garage operator $899 for a verbal assessment of a vehicle that our own team of credentialed engineers has been working on for 4 days. Ethan looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his toolbox. Okay, he said. He walked toward the door. Victoria felt the irritation shift into something else, something she didn't particularly like the shape of. Mr. Cole. He stopped but didn't turn around immediately. When he did, his expression hadn't changed. If you walk out of here, she said, there's no coming back. I know, he said. He said it the way you'd say, of course, the sky is blue. Not unkindly, just factually, as if the concept of returning was not something he had been planning to do in any scenario. He paused with his hand on the door. He looked back at the car once, and something passed across his face, something brief and complicated that Victoria couldn't read before it was gone. That car, he said, is not going to start on its own. Whatever you think the problem is, it isn't that. And the longer you keep replacing components without understanding what actually happened, the more you're going to spend on parts that aren't broken. He said it without heat, without satisfaction. I'm sorry I couldn't be more helpful. And then he walked out. For a moment, nobody spoke. Marcus Webb exhaled through his nose. Well, he said, to nobody in particular. Victoria stood very still, looking at the door he'd walked through, and did not say what she was thinking, which was that she was not entirely certain he was wrong. But the hypercar sat where it had been sitting, silent and perfect and completely useless, as the Sacramento afternoon light moved slowly across the polished floor of the bay. Somewhere across the city, in a small garage that smelled like motor oil and coffee, and whatever his daughter had been making for lunch before he'd left that morning, Ethan Cole drove home in his old truck and didn't tell anyone where he'd been. He hadn't expected anything different. He rarely did. The morning after Ethan left, Victoria held a meeting. It was 7:15, which meant she had called it for before most of the engineering staff normally arrived, which was intentional because she wanted the people in that room to understand before they sat down that the situation had changed. Not in terms of severity. It had been severe for 4 days already. but in terms of what she was willing to tolerate going forward. She sat at the head of the conference table with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, and a printed copy of the investor timeline she had already memorized. Around her sat Marcus Webb, Damian Cross, and 4 senior engineers whose names were on the original development documentation for the Hypercar's powertrain. "I want a new plan," she said. "Not an update on the old plan. A new one." Marcus opened his tablet. "We've identified 3 additional component clusters we haven't replaced yet. If we work through the weekend, we can have the next round of tests completed by how much?" He glanced down. "Component costs alone, approximately $230,000. Labor and consultant fees on top of that." Victoria looked at the table for a moment. $230,000, stacked on top of what they had already spent, chasing a problem nobody in the room could name. "Damien," she said. The CTO looked up from the notepad in front of him. He had the kind of steady gaze that read as confidence in a boardroom and something slightly different if you looked at it long enough in a smaller room. "Your assessment," she said. "I think Marcus's approach is sound," Damien said. "We have a systematic process. We're narrowing the field of variables. It takes time, but it's the right methodology. We've been narrowing the field of variables for 4 days. These are complex systems." Victoria nodded slowly, the way she nodded when she was listening to something and deciding simultaneously how much weight to give it. "What about coal?" There was a brief pause at the table, brief enough that if you weren't watching for it, you might have missed it. Damian Cross's expression didn't change. His pen moved slightly against the notepad. "I don't think a one-man garage operation is our answer here," he said. "Raymond Chu recommended him. Raymond's been out of active consulting for 6 years. His network is broad, but his technical read on current systems is," Damien paused, choosing the word carefully, "dated." Victoria looked at him. "So your position is we don't pursue coal?" "My position is that our internal team, with the right resources and the right timeline, is capable of resolving this." She nodded again. Then she picked up her coffee, found it had gone cold, and set it back down. "Fine," she said. "Weekend deadline. I want results by Monday morning, and I mean that in the specific sense. I want the car to start." She walked out of the meeting, and nobody said anything for a few seconds after she left. And then Marcus Webb rubbed his face with both hands in a way that communicated everything he hadn't said out loud. The weekend passed. It passed expensively, and it passed loudly in the engineering bay. The sound of components being removed and installed and tested and removed again, of diagnostic software cycling through screens of data that seemed to generate new questions faster than it answered old ones. 2 more outside consultants were brought in on Saturday, one from a firm in Munich and one who flew up from Los Angeles and billed at a rate that made even Marcus flinch slightly when he saw the invoice. The car did not start. On Sunday evening, Victoria walked through the bay alone after most of the team had gone home for a few hours. The facility was quiet except for the hum of the climate system. She walked up to the Hypercar and stood beside it and put her hand on the hood. Not dramatically, just resting it there, the way you might touch something when you're trying to understand what it's telling you. She was not a sentimental person by nature. She had built her career on calculation, on reading situations accurately and making decisions faster than other people were comfortable making them. She did not usually stand in empty rooms touching cars and having feelings, but 4 years of development work had gone into the machine under her hand. She had been present for the original design sessions. She had personally signed off on the powertrain specifications. She had flown to 3 countries for supplier meetings on components that existed inside this engine. There was a version of herself embedded in this car, in a way that was difficult to articulate professionally and even more difficult to admit. And it wouldn't start. She took her hand off the hood and went back to her office and sent Raymond Chu a message at 10:47 on a Sunday night that said, "Tell me more about coal." Raymond called her back at 7 the next morning before the Monday status meeting, which she was already not looking forward to. "What do you want to know?" he said. "Everything you left out the first time." A short pause. "What makes you think I left something out?" "Because you told me he was the best diagnostician you'd ever seen, and you led with the fact that he has a kid and drives a small garage, which means you knew I was going to judge him on that, and you were trying to soften the landing, which means there's something about his actual background that you thought would make me more skeptical, not less. Raymond laughed. A short, genuine sound. You're sharp. I'm annoyed. What's his background? Another pause, longer this time. Ethan Cole has a degree in mechanical engineering from UC Davis. Graduated top of his class, which, look, that's not unusual. There are a lot of top-of-class graduates who end up being mediocre engineers. But after that, he went to work for a small advanced systems development firm called Pellucid Technologies. You won't find much about them because they were acquired and absorbed about 6 years ago. Victoria went very still. What did Pellucid do? She asked, although something in the back of her mind was already assembling an answer she didn't fully want. Advanced powertrain systems development, proprietary engine management architecture. They had a contract with a larger automotive group, technology licensing, basically. A lot of their work became the foundation for some of the higher-end systems you see in performance vehicles today. He paused. Including, as far as I understand it, some of the foundational architecture in the Ashford Motors performance line. The silence on Victoria's end was long enough that Raymond said, "You still there?" "Who acquired Pellucid?" she said. "A holding group. The intellectual property got distributed across a few different channels. Some of it was licensed forward, some of it was absorbed into the acquiring company's internal R&D. Ethan left before the acquisition finalized. I don't know the full details of that. He doesn't talk about it much. After that, he did some contract work for about a year, and then opened the garage." Why did he leave Pellucid? Like I said, he doesn't talk about it much. Victoria set down her pen. It clicked against the desk surface in the quiet office. "Raymond, did you know this when you called me?" "I knew some of it," he said. "I wasn't sure how much was relevant. You knew that the man I was bringing in to look at my engine might have foundational knowledge of the architecture that engine is built on." "I knew it was possible," Raymond said. "I didn't know for certain, and I wasn't sure you'd take him seriously even if I'd led with it." He wasn't wrong about that, which was the part Victoria found hardest to sit with. She thanked him and hung up, and then she opened her laptop and started digging through company acquisition records, and what she found over the next 2 hours made the Monday status meeting feel like a very small problem. The trail wasn't clean. It rarely was with IP acquisitions from that era, when a lot of smaller development firms had been folded into larger structures during a consolidation period in the advanced automotive tech space. But it was followable if you knew what you were looking for, and Victoria was very good at following things. Pellucid Technologies had developed a proprietary engine management framework between 7 and 9 years ago. The core of that framework, the logic architecture that governed how the engine control systems communicated with performance sensors under high-load conditions, had been licensed forward twice before landing, in modified form, inside the engine management system that Ashford Motors had built its performance line on, including the Hypercar. Victoria found 3 technical papers in the company's own development archives, internal documents that had never been published, accessible only to senior engineering and executive staff, that cited Pellucid's foundational work. 2 of them listed contributing engineers by name. One of the names was E. Cole. She sat back in her chair and looked at the screen for a long moment. Then she pulled up the personnel file for Damian Cross. Damian had joined Ashford Motors 8 years ago, brought on specifically to lead the Advanced Powertrain Development Program. His previous employer, listed in his file, was a firm called Meridian Technical Group, one of the holding entities involved in the Pellucid acquisition. Victoria picked up her pen again, and put it down again, and looked out the window at the Sacramento morning happening outside, and thought very carefully about the shape of the thing she was looking at. The Monday status meeting was worse than she'd anticipated, which took some doing. Marcus presented the weekend results with the particular facial expression of a man delivering a eulogy for someone he hadn't known well, but felt genuinely bad about. The car had not started. The 2 additional consultants had not identified the problem. 3 more component clusters had been replaced. The total expenditure since the failure was now approaching $400,000. And Marcus's best estimate for resolving the issue through continued replacement-based diagnostics was somewhere between 1 and 3 weeks, with a confidence interval he described as not high. The unveiling was in 9 days. Victoria listened to all of it without interrupting, which the people in the room had learned over time was not actually a good sign. She asked 2 questions and got 2 answers she didn't find satisfying, and then she ended the meeting 12 minutes early and told Marcus to hold the diagnostic process where it currently was, don't replace anything else, don't bring in any more outside consultants, until she told him otherwise. Damien stopped her in the hallway outside. Victoria, I want to flag some concerns about pausing the diagnostic work. Noted, she said, and kept walking. We're already behind. If we stop now... She stopped and turned around. I said noted, Damien. He looked at her. His expression was controlled in the way that experienced corporate operators' expressions were controlled. Smooth, professional, difficult to read beneath the surface. Is there something else going on? I'm doing some research, she said. I'll let you know when I have something to share. She walked away, and Damien Cross watched her go. And whatever he was thinking, he kept it behind that very practiced face. Victoria found Ethan Cole's garage on her second attempt. The first time she'd tried to get there was the Monday afternoon, 3 hours after the status meeting, using the address Raymond had given her. She drove herself. No driver. No assistant. Just her own car on the highway, out past Roseville, watching the commercial and residential density thin out as Sacramento receded behind her. She found the street, found the building, pulled into the gravel lot beside a late-model pickup she recognized as the truck from her parking lot. She sat in the car for 4 minutes and then drove away. She wasn't entirely sure why. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was something more like the particular discomfort of a person who has spent 10 years being the one people come to, who is now in the position of going to someone else, and who hasn't quite worked out how to do that yet. She went back to the office. She reviewed the pellucid documentation again. She had dinner at her desk and got through half of it. She drove home at 9:30. The second attempt was Tuesday morning. She pulled into the gravel lot at 8:40. The garage bay doors were open, and she could see a car elevated on a lift inside. Something domestic, older, a transmission job by the look of the positioning. She could hear music playing from somewhere inside. Something low. She couldn't identify it from where she stood. The smell of the place reached her before she got to the door. Oil and metal and something faintly like solvent. The particular smell of a working shop that's been a working shop long enough that the smell is part of the walls. Ethan came out from under the elevated car when he heard her footsteps on the concrete. He was wearing a gray work shirt with his name on the pocket in embroidered letters, and there was a smear of grease on his left forearm that he hadn't noticed. He looked at her without visible surprise, which surprised her. Ms. Ashford, he said, I need to talk to you. Okay. She had rehearsed this part of the conversation in her car on the way out, and the version she had rehearsed was measured and professional and framed the situation in terms of business necessity. What came out instead was, I found the pellucid documentation. Something shifted in his expression. Small, controlled, but real. He looked at her for a moment, then he pulled a rag from his back pocket and wiped his hands with it in a slow, deliberate way, and then he said, You want coffee? It wasn't the response she'd been expecting. What? I've got a pot going in the back. It's not good coffee, I'll say that up front, but it's hot. He paused. You drove 40 minutes to get here. Might as well sit down. Yet. The back of the garage was a small room that served as office, break room, and storage simultaneously, with a metal desk covered in paperwork, a coffee maker that had seen better years, 2 chairs that didn't match, and a photograph on the wall of a girl who was maybe 7 or 8 years old, sitting on the hood of a car and laughing at something outside the frame. Ethan poured 2 cups and handed her one. She took it. It was, as advertised, not good coffee. How much did you find? He asked. He sat down in the chair behind the desk, and she took the other one. And the whole scene had such a peculiar quality. A 30-year-old billionaire and a 32-year-old mechanic sitting in a cluttered back room drinking bad coffee. That if Victoria had tried to describe it to anyone later, she thought they probably wouldn't have believed her. Enough, she said. The E. Cole on the technical papers. That's you. It's me. You were part of the team that developed the engine management architecture that our powertrain is built on. Part of the team, he said. Yeah. You would have known that when you walked into my facility. He looked at her steadily. I knew it when Raymond called me. Victoria held the coffee cup in both hands. Then why didn't you say so? Because you didn't ask. He said it simply, not as an accusation. You asked me to look at a car. I looked at it. I told you I could tell you what was wrong with it. That's all I offered. For $899. That's what I charge. Ethan, she heard the sharpness in her own voice and made herself dial it back. You understand what I'm asking. You have direct foundational knowledge of the architecture inside that engine. The fact that you didn't disclose that changes the nature of what happened. He thought about that for a moment. Does it? Yes? How? She opened her mouth and then closed it, because the answer she'd had ready, which was something about professional disclosure and the reasonable expectation of relevant expertise, started to fall apart when she looked at it from his angle. He had walked into her facility. He had looked at her car. He had offered to tell her what was wrong with it. She had laughed at him, and her executives had laughed with her, and she had told him that his garage was not capable of being relevant to her company, after which she had expected him to volunteer additional information as a gesture of goodwill. The silence in the small room was not comfortable, but it was honest. You're right, she said. It cost her something to say it. Not a lot. She was not someone who found admitting mistakes intolerable. She had learned too early that people who couldn't do it tended to make the same mistakes repeatedly. But something. The way you were treated when you came in was dismissive. That's not an excuse for I'm not looking for an apology right now, Ethan said. What do you want, Ms. Ashford? She looked at him. I want you to come back and fix the car. Okay, he said. She blinked. Just, okay? How much time do you have before the unveiling? 9 days? He nodded slowly, looking at the desk. I can come Thursday. I've got a job I need to finish here first, and I need to arrange someone to pick up my daughter from school. Victoria stared at him. Ethan, the car is worth $5 million. The unveiling has global media coverage. Investors are... I know what the car is worth, he said quietly. I know what the unveiling is, and I'm telling you I can be there Thursday, but I need to finish the job I'm already in the middle of, and I need to make sure my kid gets picked up from school. He met her eyes. Those things aren't negotiable. Something about the way he said it, without defiance, without apology, just stating the plain facts of his situation as if they were as real and as valid as anything else in the conversation, stopped whatever she had been about to say. She nodded. Thursday. One condition. Name it. Your engineering team stays back from the car while I work. They can be in the room, but nobody touches anything, nobody makes suggestions, and nobody interrupts me. If I want information from them, I'll ask. Victoria considered that. In the normal course of events, she did not agree to conditions before knowing their full scope. But she looked at Ethan Cole sitting behind his cluttered desk in his greasy work shirt with his cup of bad coffee, and she thought about $400,000 of parts that hadn't fixed anything, and 9 days until the entire thing became a different kind of problem. Fine, she said. He nodded. Thursday morning, 8 o'clock. She stood up and set her coffee cup on the edge of the desk. She looked at the photograph on the wall, the girl on the car hood, laughing. Your daughter, she said. Nora, he said. She's 8. She already knows more about carburetors than most adults. Victoria almost said something about that, and then didn't because it felt like it was from a conversation they hadn't earned yet. She thanked him for the coffee, which she meant somewhat ironically since it had been genuinely bad, and walked back out through the garage and into the Tuesday morning air. She sat in her car for a moment before starting it. She had gone in there with a set of things she'd planned to say and left having said different ones, and she wasn't sure exactly how that had happened. What she did know, what she turned over on the drive back to Sacramento, was that she had found the pellucid documentation because she'd been looking for a way to understand Ethan Cole better. And what she understood now, sitting with it, was that the documentation wasn't actually the most important thing. The most important thing was that Ethan had stood in her engineering bay and told her the car wouldn't start on its own, and he'd been right. When she got back to the office, she told Renata to clear her Thursday morning calendar. Then she sat down and looked again at the personnel file for Damian Cross, and specifically at the timeline of his employment at Meridian Technical Group, and the timeline of Ethan Cole's departure from Pellucid, and the way those two timelines overlapped at one particular point. The records she had access to were internal company documents, and they didn't tell the whole story. They never did. But they told enough of a story that Victoria found herself sitting very still in her chair for a long time, thinking about what it meant that the one person who had recognized Ethan Cole's name when she'd mentioned him, who had reacted with that almost invisible pause over his notepad, was the same person who had come from an organization directly connected to Pellucid's acquisition, and who had been telling her, consistently and calmly, that bringing Ethan Cole back into the building was unnecessary. She picked up her phone and called the company's internal legal team and asked them to pull everything they had on the Pellucid acquisition chain. She told them she needed it by Wednesday. Outside her window, Sacramento was having a normal Tuesday. Traffic moving on the streets below, afternoon light coming in flat and bright from the west. The world entirely unaware that in 9 days, either a hypercar was going to drive out onto a stage in front of global media, or Victoria Ashford was going to have the worst professional week of her life. She went back to work. She didn't tell Damian about Thursday. She told Marcus, quietly, at the end of the day Tuesday, and she told him to keep it between the two of them for the moment. Marcus looked at her with the expression of a man who has been carrying a heavy load for a while and is trying to decide if a stranger offering to help is actually good news or just a new complication. "You think he can fix it?" Marcus asked. "I think he has a better chance than we do right now," she said. Marcus nodded slowly. "What do you want me to tell the team for Thursday?" "Tell them they're observing," she said, "and tell them I expect professional behavior. No commentary, no comparisons, no under-the-breath anything." She looked at him directly. "If I find out anyone was disrespectful to him while he's working, they won't be working here Friday." Marcus raised his eyebrows slightly. He had been with the company long enough to know that Victoria Ashford meant what she said in that register of voice. "Understood," he said. "Keep Damian out of the loop until Thursday morning," she said. "I'll handle telling him." She didn't say why, and Marcus, to his credit, didn't ask. That night, she drove home through the Sacramento evening traffic and sat in her kitchen and ate leftover Thai food and looked at the technical papers from the Pellucid era that she'd had printed and taken home. The one with Ethan's name on it was 18 pages of dense engineering language with 2 diagrams. She wasn't a trained engineer. Her background was finance, with enough technical education to function effectively in an engineering-heavy company, which meant she could understand the papers and outline without necessarily following every technical step. But she followed enough. What Ethan and his team at Pellucid had figured out was a method for managing sensor calibration in high-performance engine systems under the specific conditions of high-load acceleration, the edge case where most systems of that era had struggled. The framework they'd developed was elegant in the way that genuinely good engineering solutions were elegant. It solved a complex problem through a relatively simple architectural shift that, once you saw it, made you wonder why people had been approaching it the other way. She turned the last page over and looked at the ceiling of her kitchen. $899. She thought about what it said about a person, what it said about what he valued, or maybe about what he'd decided wasn't worth fighting about anymore. That he'd walked into her building, recognized immediately what no one else had recognized in 4 days, offered to share that recognition for the same flat rate he charged anyone who brought a car to his garage, and when she'd laughed at him, had simply picked up his toolbox and left. Not angrily, not dramatically, just, "This is what I charge, and if you don't want to pay it, I have other things to do." She folded the papers and put them on the kitchen counter and finished her food, and then she sat at the table in the quiet of her own house for a while, not doing anything in particular, which was not something she did very often. Thursday felt very far away. Wednesday arrived the way bad days sometimes do, quietly, without announcement. The morning looking ordinary enough that you almost trusted it. Victoria was at her desk by 6:45. The legal team's report on the Pellucid acquisition chain was waiting in her inbox, sent at 11:50 the previous night by someone who had clearly understood that when Victoria Ashford said she needed something by Wednesday, she meant as early in Wednesday as was physically possible. It was 31 pages, dense with corporate language and acquisition timelines and IP licensing trails, and she read all of it before her assistant arrived at 8. By the time she finished, she had a very clear picture of something she wished she didn't have a clear picture of. The Pellucid acquisition had been handled through Meridian Technical Group, Damien's former employer, 8 years ago. The IP transfer had been structured in a way that was technically legal, but reading it carefully had some notable features. Several of the contributing engineers at Pellucid had been pushed out prior to the acquisition finalizing, which meant their equity positions in the company's IP proceeds had been either significantly reduced or eliminated entirely, depending on how their employment contracts had been written. The report didn't name names. It was a structural document, not a personnel one, but the timeline of departures lined up with what Raymond had told her about Ethan leaving before the acquisition closed. And then those engineers' work had been absorbed into Meridian's portfolio, and from there had been licensed forward into the automotive industry, and from there, through 2 more transactions and 1 strategic partnership, had ended up as foundational architecture inside Ashford Motors' performance line. Victoria sat with that for a long time. She was not naive about how IP acquisitions worked in the tech and engineering space. She had been around long enough to know that the path from original innovation to commercialized product was rarely clean, that the people who came up with things and the people who profited from them were often different people, and that the law generally permitted this as long as the paperwork was in order. She had never particularly liked this feature of the industry, but she had accepted it as structural reality. What was harder to accept was the possibility that the man who had stood in her engineering bay last week, whom she had laughed at, had been specifically pushed out of Pellucid by people operating within the same network that had eventually fed his work into her company. That Damien Cross, sitting in her Monday morning meetings with his silver hair and his composed expression and his consistent position that Ethan Cole was not their answer, had specific personal reasons to keep Ethan Cole out of this building. She picked up her phone and called Damien's cell. He answered on the second ring. "Victoria, I was just about to come to my office," she said. "Now?" "Dumb." He arrived 7 minutes later, which meant he'd been somewhere in the building already, probably his own office, which meant he'd also been in early, which meant something about his own state of mind that she filed away without dwelling on it. He sat down across from her desk. He was dressed well, as always. A charcoal suit, a dark tie, the kind of presentation that communicated competence and stability and had probably served him well in a dozen boardrooms over the years. He looked at the papers on her desk. She had left the legal report visible, not trying to hide it, and his expression did something very small and very controlled that she would have missed if she hadn't been watching for it. "I want to talk about Pellucid Technologies," she said. A pause that lasted approximately 2 seconds. In a normal conversation, 2 seconds was nothing. In this one, it was a complete paragraph. "That's a long time ago," Damien said. 8 years. "What specifically are you—" "Oh, you were at Meridian when they handled the Pellucid acquisition." "I was at Meridian, yes. I wasn't directly involved in every transaction they—" "Damien." She kept her voice level. "I've spent 2 days reading acquisition documents and personnel records and IP licensing chains. I'm not asking you whether you were involved. I'm telling you what I know and giving you the opportunity to tell me what I don't." He looked at her. Whatever calculation was happening behind his eyes, it was fast and experienced. The calculation of someone who has navigated difficult conversations before and knows which direction to move in when the room starts contracting. "What do you want to know?" he said. "Ethan Cole," she said. "What happened with Ethan Cole at Pellucid?" A longer pause this time. Damien looked at the window, the Sacramento morning outside, gray and bright simultaneously, and then back at her. "He was talented," Damien said. "Genuinely. I won't pretend otherwise. The framework he and his team developed was significant work. But Ethan was difficult to manage. He had strong opinions about how his work should be used and who should have access to it and what the commercialization path should look like. He wasn't wrong, necessarily, but he wasn't realistic either. When the acquisition discussions started, he became resistant. He wanted protections built into the transfer that weren't commercially viable. He wanted attribution requirements, limitations on how the architecture could be modified. Damien said it matter-of-factly, as if he were describing a technical specification problem rather than a person's career. He made the process harder than it needed to be. So he was pushed out. His contract wasn't renewed. That's not the same as before the acquisition finalized. Damien's jaw moved slightly. Yes, which affected his equity position. His contract terms were his contract terms. I didn't write them. But you knew what they said. He didn't answer that directly. Victoria, this is ancient history. What does it have to do with the car? It has to do with the fact that you have known, from the moment I mentioned Ethan Cole's name last week, exactly who he was and exactly what his connection to our engine architecture was. And you told me his name didn't ring any bells, and you told me Raymond Chu's network was dated, and you have been actively and consistently steering me away from the one person who might actually be able to fix this car. For a week. So while we spent $400,000 on parts that didn't solve anything, she watched his face. I want to understand why I shouldn't consider that a serious problem. The silence in the room was the kind that had weight. Damien Cross looked at her across the desk, and for the first time since she'd known him, the composed surface of his expression slipped enough that she could see something underneath it. Not guilt exactly, or not only guilt, but the particular weariness of a person who has been managing something for a long time and is very tired of managing it. I was going to find the solution, he said. The team was getting closer. Another few days. The team was not getting closer, Victoria said. Marcus told me this morning that absent a fundamentally different diagnostic approach, we were looking at another 1 to 3 weeks minimum. We have 8 days. I know how many days we have. Then explain to me, she said, and her voice was quieter now, which was sometimes more effective than being loud, why you thought it was acceptable to let this company burn $400,000 and potentially miss a global unveiling rather than acknowledge that Ethan Cole was relevant. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had dropped too, and some of the smoothness had gone out of it. Because if Cole walks in here and fixes this in 20 minutes, he said, and it comes out that the foundational architecture in our engine is work that originated with him, work that went through Pellucid, through Meridian, and into our company, people are going to start asking questions about the chain of that acquisition. And some of those questions are going to have answers I don't want public. Victoria looked at him steadily. There it is, she said. He held her gaze. It was a small credit to him that he didn't look away, she thought. You protected yourself, she said, at the expense of this company, at the expense of 8 days and $400,000 and the potential collapse of a project that 400 people have spent 4 years building. It wasn't... He stopped, started again. It wasn't only that. I genuinely believed the team could find it. Maybe you did. It doesn't change what happened. She stood up. I'm going to need your security badge and your access credentials by end of day. HR will be in touch about the formal process. He looked up at her sharply. Victoria, Damien. She said it gently, which was almost worse than saying it hard. Go home. We'll handle the rest through the proper channels. He stood up slowly, the way people stood up when their legs weren't entirely cooperating with the situation. He picked up his notepad, an automatic gesture, reaching for the thing he always had in hand, and then set it back down on the chair because there was no meeting to take notes for. At the door, he stopped. She thought he might say something more, but he didn't. He just stood there for a second, and then he walked out. Victoria sat back down at her desk and looked at the legal report for a moment, and then she closed it and set it aside, because the conversation she'd been dreading was over, and now she had a different problem, which was the conversation she'd been avoiding. She called Marcus at 9 and told him about Damien. She told him in broad strokes, no detail about the Pellucid connection not yet, that would come through the proper investigation process. Just that Damien was being removed from his position pending a formal review, and that Marcus was to consider himself acting technical lead effective immediately. Marcus was quiet for several seconds after she finished. Okay, he said finally. How are you with that? I'm okay with it. He paused. Does this have something to do with the car? It has everything to do with the car, she said. I'll explain more when I can. Right now I need you focused on Thursday. Ethan Cole is coming at 8. I need the bay cleared of any components that were pulled during the replacement process. Put them in storage, don't dispose of them. And I need the car in the same state it was in when he first saw it, as close as possible. The diagnostic ports are still accessible. Good. Keep them that way. Victoria, he hesitated. You really think he can fix it? It wasn't quite a question. She thought about Ethan in his back room, drinking bad coffee, asking her what she wanted. The specificity of him. The way he'd said my diagnostic fee is $899 in a room full of people waiting to dismiss him. Yes, she said. I think he can fix it. She left the office at 2 and drove out to Roseville. This was the third time she'd made the drive, and she was getting better at it. Not in the sense of finding it easier, but in the sense of knowing what to expect from herself on the way out there. She knew she was going to think about what she was going to say. She knew that what she planned to say and what she actually said were going to diverge somewhere around the halfway point. She knew the garage was going to smell like oil and metal, and she was going to feel slightly out of place in it, and that Ethan was going to be doing something practical and physical when she arrived and was going to stop doing it and look at her with that steady, patient expression that she found simultaneously calming and destabilizing. She was right about most of it. He was outside when she pulled in, crouched beside a car in the gravel lot, looking at something near the front tire. He heard the car and stood up, brushing his knees, and watched her park. Today the work shirt was dark blue, and there was a streak of something on his right hand that he noticed and wiped on his jeans in an unself-conscious way that told her he'd forgotten the rag was in his back pocket. You're early, he said. I know. I'm sorry to show up without calling. It's fine. He looked at her in a measuring way. Something happened. Yes. You want to come in? They went inside, not to the back room this time, but into the garage bay itself, which was open and bright with the bay doors up, the elevated car still on the lift from Tuesday. He leaned against the workbench, and she stood near the lift, and she told him about Damien. Not everything. Not the full acquisition chain, not yet, but the part that was relevant to him, that Damien had known who Ethan was from the start, had actively concealed it, and had just been removed from the company. Ethan listened to all of it without interrupting. His expression during this was difficult to read. Not surprise, she noticed. Not anger either, or not quite. Something more like the face of someone who is hearing a confirmation of something they had suspected for a very long time and are not quite sure how to feel about being right. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Damien Cross, he said. You knew him. I knew of him. He was on the Meridian side of things when Pellucid got acquired. I never dealt with him directly. He looked at the floor of the bay. But I knew someone at Meridian had pushed to make sure the engineering team dispersed before the acquisition closed. I could never prove it was him specifically. You suspected. I suspected. He said it without heat. Didn't do much with it. By the time I figured out what had actually happened, I was already done with all of it. He looked up. I had Nora by then. She was almost a year old. Her mother was gone. He said that last part simply, without further elaboration, in the tone people used when they'd made peace with a hard thing and didn't need to perform the difficulty of it for other people. I didn't have the energy for a fight I probably wasn't going to win anyway. Victoria looked at him. That was your work, she said. The architecture. It ended up in my company's engine. You got nothing from that. He shrugged. A small, honest movement. That's not entirely accurate. I got a salary while I was doing it. I got the experience of actually solving a hard problem, which nobody can take out of your head. He paused. And I got the garage eventually. I like the garage. She looked around the bay. The lift, the tools arranged on the wall with a practicality that had its own kind of order, the oil-stained floor, the photograph she could see through the open door to the back room, the girl on the car hood. Ethan, she said, I want to say something, and I want to say it correctly, so I'm going to take a second before I do. He waited. She had thought about this on the drive. She had thought about it the night before, in her kitchen, after she'd gone through the Pellucid papers again. She had been composing and discarding versions of it for 2 days, and she was still not entirely sure she had the right version, but she had the most honest one. When you came to my facility last week, she said, I judged you before I knew anything about you. I judged you because of how you arrived and what you were wearing and what your business looked like on the surface. I made you feel small in a room full of people who were all watching me do it. That was wrong. It wasn't a small thing." She paused. "And I understand if that's not something an apology covers. I'm not here to tell you that saying sorry makes it okay. I'm here because you deserve to hear it said anyway." He looked at her for a long time. The garage was quiet except for the distant sound of traffic on the highway, and from somewhere outside, a bird she couldn't identify. "Okay," he said. "Okay?" "I heard you." He straightened up from the workbench. "What time Thursday?" She looked at him. "You're still willing to come?" "I said I would." "After everything I just told you, Damien, the acquisition, the way you were treated." "I know," he said. "But none of that is about the car." He said it with a simplicity that stopped her. "The car's a good car. Whatever mess the people around it made, the car itself, it's good work. I want to see it run." Victoria stood there in the middle of the garage bay and felt something she couldn't have named precisely. Not admiration exactly, not embarrassment exactly, something that was the particular compound feeling of being in the presence of someone whose value system was different from yours, in a way that was making you quietly reconsider your own. 8 o'clock, she said. 8 o'clock, he agreed. "And I'll need the original calibration documentation for the engine management system. Everything from the first development build, not the modified versions. Can you get that?" "I'll have it tonight." "And nobody touches the car before I get there." "Nobody touches it," she said. "You have my word." He nodded, and that was that. The conversation ending the way his conversation seemed to end, without ceremony, without extended anything, just, "We know what we're doing, see you then." She walked back out to her car. She sat in it for a moment before starting the engine, the way she'd been doing at the end of every conversation with him, as if she needed a few seconds to let the particular quality of those interactions settle before reintroducing herself to the rest of the world. She drove back to Sacramento feeling something she hadn't felt in about a week, which was close to certain. Dates. Thursday morning started at 6:15 for Victoria, who got to the facility 2 hours early and spent the first of those hours walking through the engineering bay, making sure everything was as she'd specified. The replacement components were gone, moved to storage. The diagnostic ports were accessible. The car sat on its platform looking exactly as it had on the morning all of this had started, perfect and silent and somehow waiting. The second hour she spent in a conversation with Marcus that was partly logistics and partly something else, a version of what she'd said to Ethan, compressed and adjusted for a different kind of relationship. "I could have handled this better," she said. "From the beginning." Marcus looked at her across his desk with the expression of a man who had spent a week watching things go sideways and was reserving final judgment until the situation resolved. "You made the decisions you made with what you knew," he said. "I made some of them because of what I assumed." He was quiet for a moment. "We all did," he said finally. "The guy showed up with an old toolbox. It's hard to—" He stopped. "I'm not saying that's an excuse. I just think it's honest." It was honest. That was the thing about Marcus. He was not particularly sophisticated or political, and he said true things without dressing them up, and she had always valued that about him even when it was uncomfortable. "Make sure the team understands what I said about professional behavior today," she told him. "I mean it." "Already done," he said. 3 times. Ethan arrived at 8:04, which, given that he had a child to get to school first and a 40-minute drive after that, she considered essentially punctual. He pulled into the visitor lot in his truck and sat in it for a moment before getting out. She saw this from the second-floor window, as she had the first time, and she watched him look at the facility with an expression she couldn't fully read from a distance. Something measured, something that might have been memory. He got out and retrieved his toolbox from the truck bed and walked toward the entrance. She met him in the lobby. "Morning," he said. "Good morning. Did Nora get to school okay?" He looked at her, a small, slightly surprised look, the look of someone who doesn't expect to be asked that. "Yeah, she made me carry her backpack to the car because she said it was too heavy. It wasn't too heavy. She just wanted company on the walk." Victoria almost said something about that and then did, because this time it felt like a conversation they'd earned. How do you know the difference? 8 years of Nora, he said. You learn the tells. She smiled. A real one, not the professional version. Come on, I'll walk you in. The engineering bay had a particular atmosphere when they walked in, the kind of charged stillness that happens when a group of people are trying very hard to appear relaxed and failing slightly. 14 members of the engineering team were present, arranged around the perimeter of the space in a way that wasn't quite casual. Some of them had tablets, some of them had nothing, because they'd been told this was observation only and had found themselves uncertain what to do with their hands. Marcus stood near the door to the monitoring station. He nodded at Ethan when he walked in. A simple, direct nod, person to person, no performance in it. And Ethan nodded back. There was someone absent from the bay that every person in the room noticed and nobody mentioned. The space where Damien Cross would normally have stood was just space. Ethan walked to the car. He set his toolbox down on the floor beside the platform. Not on it, on the floor, as if proximity to the car was something to be approached rather than assumed. He stood back from it first, the same way he had the first time, just looking. A full circuit around the platform, slow, his eyes doing the thing they did where it looked like reading. Nobody spoke. One of the junior engineers, a young woman named Priya, who had been with the company for 18 months and was still in the stage of her career where she found silences in professional settings almost physically uncomfortable, made a small movement that might have been the beginning of an explanatory comment, and Marcus put a hand on her arm and she stopped. Ethan crouched at the front of the car and looked at something near the lower edge of the engine compartment for about 30 seconds. Then he stood up, went to his toolbox, and retrieved a device. The same one from the first visit, a diagnostic interface that was visibly older than the equipment the engineering team used, with a worn case and a cable that had been repaired near the connector. He connected it to the diagnostic port and watched the readout. The readout took longer this time. He stood there and read it the way you read something that requires attention. Not quick, not impatient, just present. A full 4 minutes. Victoria, watching from near the door, found herself counting. Then he disconnected the device. He stood up and put it back in the toolbox. He reached in and found a second tool, a calibration interface, smaller, with a keypad, and he looked at the documentation she had sent him the night before, the original build specifications. He'd printed them and brought them, she noticed. The pages were slightly worn at the edges, which meant he'd read them more than once. He opened a panel on the engine management array. He connected the calibration interface, and then he began to work. It was not dramatic what he did. That was the first thing Victoria noticed, that the people in the room who had been expecting some kind of revelation were going to have to revise their expectations. He worked quietly and methodically, cross-referencing the documentation, inputting values, running checks on the display screen of the calibration interface, going back to the documentation, adjusting. His hands moved with the specific economy of someone who has done physical work for long enough that the movements have become part of how he thinks. Not fast, not showy, just exactly as much as needed. No more. 12 minutes passed. Then 15. At 17 minutes, he stepped back from the engine compartment. He looked at Marcus. Can you have someone try the ignition? The room was so quiet that when Marcus said Priya, his voice seemed to carry. The young engineer walked to the driver's side. Her hands were slightly shaking, Victoria noticed, and thought that was probably the most honest thing she'd seen in the bay all morning. And she opened the door and sat down and put her hand on the start control. She looked at Ethan. He nodded. She pressed the ignition. The engine caught on the first turn. It didn't sputter and then find itself. It didn't require a second attempt. It caught clean and strong, and the sound of it, a low, resonant, layered sound, the kind that was felt as much as heard, filled the engineering bay and bounced off the 40-foot ceilings and settled into everyone in the room differently. Priya made a sound that wasn't a word. One of the senior engineers put both hands over his mouth. Marcus Webb pressed his eyes closed for about 2 seconds with the expression of a man releasing something he had been holding for a very long time. Victoria stood near the door and listened to the engine run and felt a complicated collection of things that she didn't try to sort through in that moment, because some things were better just to feel first and understand later. Ethan was already crouching beside the car again, listening to the engine from the outside, his head slightly tilted. He wasn't celebrating, he was checking. Even now, even with the engine running, he was still working, listening for anything that wasn't right, the way you listen to something you'd built and cared about, checking that the repair was real and not just the beginning of a different problem. After about 90 seconds, he stood up. He picked up his toolbox. Victoria crossed the bay toward him, and the engineering team parted without being asked. She stopped in front of him. He looked at her with that expression, steady, patient, not performing anything. "What was it?" she said. "Software update pushed to the primary performance sensor 3 weeks ago," he said. "It overwrote the original calibration values. The sensor was reading correctly according to the new parameters, but the new parameters conflicted with the original engine management logic that the system was built on. Every component people replaced was fine. The problem was that the underlying architecture and the updated software were speaking different versions of the same language." He paused. "It's the kind of thing you'd catch immediately if you knew the original architecture. You'd miss it completely if you didn't." She looked at him. "Who approved the software update?" He met her eyes. "That's going to be in the logs," he said quietly. "I'd look at them." She already knew what they were going to say. She thought he probably knew she knew. "Ethan," she said, "thank you." He nodded once. "The car sounds good," he said, and there was something in the way he said it. Simple, genuine, the way you talked about something you had a real feeling for, that was more than a professional assessment. He turned toward the door. "Ethan." She stopped him without quite meaning to. He looked back. "That's it? You're just leaving?" "I've got a car to get back to," he said. "The transmission job from Tuesday." A pause. "Send the invoice to the address on file." $899, she said. "That's what I charge," he said, and he walked out, and the sound of the Hypercar's engine filled the bay behind him, and 17 engineers stood in various states of emotion around a car that was finally, after 8 days and $400,000, and one conversation in a cluttered back room over bad coffee, doing exactly what it had always been capable of doing. Victoria stood in the middle of the bay and listened to the engine run. It sounded like what it was, extraordinary and patient and entirely indifferent to how long it had taken everyone else to catch up. The engine ran for 11 minutes before Marcus cut it. Not because anything was wrong, it sounded better with every passing minute, the systems finding their rhythm, the particular layered resonance of a high-performance engine that had been correctly calibrated, settling into something that the engineers in the bay recognized, on a physical level, as right. Marcus cut it, because he was thinking clearly enough to remember that they had 8 days until the unveiling, and the car had just been restarted for the first time in over a week, and running it extended without a full systems check first was the kind of decision that felt good in the moment and created problems later. He was right to do it. Victoria told him so after the bay cleared out. "Run the full protocol," she said. "Everything. I want documentation of the car's current state that we can put in front of the investors before the weekend." "I'll have a preliminary report by tonight," Marcus said. "Good." She paused. "How is the team?" He considered that for a second. "Relieved," he said. "A little embarrassed, some of them. Priya cried in the break room, I heard. Not bad crying, the other kind." Victoria nodded. She understood both kinds. "The update logs," she said. "I need whoever handles system administration to pull them today. Every software update pushed to the engine management array in the last 60 days, with timestamps and authorization signatures." Marcus looked at her steadily. "You already know what you're going to find." "I want documentation," she said, "not assumptions." He nodded and went to work, and Victoria walked back upstairs to her office and sat down and looked at her desk for a moment. The cleared surface, the morning's papers stacked to the side, the cold coffee she'd poured 2 hours ago and forgotten, and let herself exist in the quiet for about 30 seconds before picking up the phone. The first call was to the company's outside legal counsel. The second was to the board chair, a 73-year-old named Arthur Fenn, who had been in the automotive industry since before Victoria was born and who had a particular talent for being unsurprised by things that would surprise anyone else. "The car starts," she told him. "Good," he said. "Damien Cross has been removed. There's going to be an investigation." A brief pause. "How bad?" "I don't know yet," she said. "Bad enough. I want to get ahead of it before the unveiling." "Send me what you have," Arthur said. "I'll make some calls." She spent the next hour writing a detailed summary of everything she knew. The Pellucid acquisition chain, Damien's concealment, the software update, Ethan's role in diagnosing and fixing the car. She wrote it carefully, without editorializing, keeping it to facts and timelines and documented connections. When she finished, she read it back once and then sent it to Arthur, to legal, and to her own personal archive. Then she opened a new email and sat looking at the blank body of it for a moment. She typed, "Ethan," and then stopped and thought about what she actually wanted to say, which was more than she had room to say in an email. She closed it without sending and made a note on her desk calendar instead. Roseville, this week. The system administration logs came back to her at 4:17 that afternoon, delivered by a young man from the IT department named Kevin, who had the particular expression of someone who has found something he wasn't expecting to find and is uncertain whether finding it is going to be good or bad for him personally. "Just leave them," she told him. "Thank you." She read through the logs after he left. What she found was what she had expected to find, which didn't make it easier to look at. 12 days before the engine failure, a software update had been pushed to the primary performance sensor array. The update was logged as a routine calibration adjustment, the kind of incremental maintenance push that happened regularly in complex systems and rarely required senior sign-off because the individual changes were small and the approval chain had been designed for efficiency rather than scrutiny. The authorization signature on the update was a secondary engineering account, not Damien's name directly, but the update package itself, the file, the version, the parameters it contained, had been approved at the CTO level 3 days before it was pushed. The approval was buried in a batch authorization that covered 17 separate minor updates, the kind of document that got signed quickly during a busy week without being read line by line. Damien's digital signature was on the batch authorization. Victoria sat with that for a long time. It was possible, she made herself consider this seriously, because she had learned over the years that the version of events that confirmed what you already suspected was not always the correct one. It was possible that the approval had been genuinely routine, that Damien had signed a batch document without looking closely at what this particular update contained, and that the conflict between the new parameters and the original architecture had been an oversight rather than an intention. But Ethan had fixed the problem in 17 minutes, using nothing but the original documentation and a calibration interface, which meant that someone with foundational knowledge of the architecture, as Damien had professional proximity to through the Pellucid acquisition, would have known what the update would do, would have known it would create a conflict, would have known that conflict would present as a failure mode that looked inexplicable without knowing the original system logic, the kind of failure mode that a company's internal engineering team, working from current documentation and modern diagnostic tools, might spend weeks and hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to solve without ever finding the root cause. She put the logs down on the desk. She was not, by temperament, someone who assumed the worst about people without evidence. She had built her business by reading people accurately, and reading people accurately meant holding space for complexity and mistake alongside malice. She had known Damien Cross for 5 years. She had promoted him twice. She had valued his judgment in boardrooms and in development meetings and in a dozen difficult decisions. The idea that he had deliberately introduced a failure into the company's flagship product to protect himself from scrutiny about the Pellucid acquisition. That was a serious thing to conclude. It required a level of deliberate harm that she did not reach easily. But the logs said what they said. And Ethan's question, the one he'd asked in the engineering bay before he picked up his toolbox and walked out, hung in her head with a weight that didn't go away. Who approved the software update? He had asked it gently, almost quietly, like someone who already knew the answer and was giving her the chance to find it herself. She forwarded the logs to legal with a one-line note. For the investigation, please advise on next steps. Marcus brought her the preliminary systems report at 6:45 just as the facility was settling into its evening quiet. He set it on her desk and stood across from her, and they went through it together. The engine in sound condition, all systems nominal, calibration holding at the parameters Ethan had set. No secondary issues identified. The car was road ready. Not just engineering bay ready, road ready, meaning they could put a driver in it tomorrow if they needed to. 8 days, Marcus said. We're going to make it. Victoria looked at the report. Thanks to Ethan. Yeah, Marcus paused. I've been thinking about that. About how I behaved when he first came in. He said it without preamble, which was his way. I didn't laugh at him. I want to be clear about that. But I didn't say anything when other people did. I just stood there with my tablet and let it happen. And I've been thinking about what that means. Victoria looked at him. In 5 years of working together, Marcus Webb had never once offered her an unsolicited reflection on his own professional behavior. It was, she understood, a significant departure. It means you're human, she said. That's not an excuse. It's just what it means. I know. He looked at the report. What are we going to do about the fact that his architecture is basically what our performance line is built on? That's going to go through legal and the board, she said. It's not simple, but I want to get it right. She paused. I want to get all of it right. Marcus nodded slowly. The team wants to know what to tell people about what happened with the car, about Damien. The media is going to ask. I'm going to handle the media personally, she said. Tell the team to keep quiet until I've made a formal statement. And tell them, she stopped. Tell them the car was fixed by the engineer who helped design the architecture it's built on. That's the true version. I'm not dressing it up differently. Marcus picked up the report. Okay, he said. After he left, she sat in her office for a long time with the lights on and the Sacramento evening happening outside the window, the traffic and the light and the city doing its ordinary thing, entirely unaware of the week that had happened inside this building. She thought about Damien, where he was tonight, what he was doing, whether he was relieved that it was over or afraid of what came next. She found, somewhat to her surprise, that she didn't feel vindicated about it. She felt tired. The kind of tired that came not from exhaustion, but from the particular weight of having been in close proximity to something that had been dishonest for a long time and only recently come to light. She also thought about what Ethan had said in his garage, about the acquisition and the pellucid years. I didn't have the energy for a fight. I probably wasn't going to win anyway. I had Nora by then. She tried to imagine that. Being 24, 25 years old, having done genuinely important work that had been absorbed and redistributed and profited from without you, and making the active decision to let it go. Not because you thought it was right, but because the fight would cost more than you had available to give. And then building something smaller, quieter, more yours. A garage with one lift and bad coffee and a photograph on the wall of the thing that actually mattered. She wasn't sure she could have done it. She wasn't sure she would have had the specific kind of clarity that required. The next morning, she drove out to Roseville. She hadn't called ahead. She told herself this was because she had a tendency to rehearse conversations she hadn't earned yet, and she was trying to break the habit. But the more honest reason was that she wasn't entirely sure what she was going to say, and she thought arriving first and figuring it out in real time might actually produce a better conversation than the one she'd been scripting in her head. The garage was open when she got there at 9:15, the bay doors up, morning sun coming in at a low angle that made the concrete floor look almost warm. The elevated car from before was gone, finished, she assumed, and in its place was a different vehicle, a late-model sedan that had seen some miles. Ethan was underneath it on a creeper, his feet visible near the front passenger tire. She stood in the bay entrance. Ethan! The creeper moved. He slid out from under the car and sat up and looked at her with his hands on his knees. The work shirt today was the first one she'd seen, the gray one with his name on the pocket. He looked at her face and apparently read something there that made him wipe his hands on the rag in his pocket and stand up. You want to come in? He said. This is fine, she said. I don't want to take up too much of your morning. He leaned against the fender of the sedan, a slightly precarious lean, The posture of someone who is comfortable in a space and knows exactly which surfaces will hold his weight. How's the car? Perfect, she said. Running exactly right. Systems check came back clean. Good. The logs confirmed the update, she said. Authorization chain traced back to Damien. Legal is handling it. He nodded once, without visible satisfaction, which she'd half expected. He didn't seem like someone who found satisfaction in that kind of outcome, in being proven right about something that had hurt him. He looked like someone who was filing it away in the category of things that were finished now, and taking up a proportionate amount of space there. I want to talk to you about the pellucid architecture, she said. He looked at her steadily. Okay. Our legal team is doing a full review of the IP chain. I'm not going to pretend I can tell you right now exactly what that looks like on the other end, because I don't know when. There are a lot of layers and a lot of time has passed, and I'm not a lawyer. She kept her voice even. But I want you to know that the review is happening, and I want you to have counsel of your own when it does. If there are remedies available to you, I want you to have access to them. I'm not looking to minimize this. He was quiet for a moment. Victoria, he said, which was the first time he'd used her first name, she noticed, and registered what it cost him in terms of the particular pride of someone who didn't give that kind of informality easily. That's 8 years old. I signed contracts. Some of those contracts were written badly in my favor, and I signed them anyway because I was 24 and I thought the work mattered more than the paperwork. That's not entirely someone else's fault. The contracts were what they were, she said. What happened after, the way the acquisition was managed, the way the team was dispersed before it closed, that's a separate question. Maybe, he said, but I've got a life. He said it simply, without resignation and without false peace, just as a factual statement. I've got the garage, I've got Nora, I've got work I'm good at and that I actually like doing. If your lawyers find something, I'm not going to turn it down. But I'm also not. I haven't been sitting around waiting for this to come around. She believed him. That was the thing. She could see clearly that he was not performing equanimity for her benefit. That the life he'd built out in Roseville, the one that involved bad coffee and a creeper and a kid who made him carry her backpack to the car, was actually the life he wanted. That the garage was not a consolation prize. That something had shifted in him at some point in those 8 years. Some fundamental reorientation toward what he valued. And the result was a person who was genuinely difficult to wound with the things most people used to wound each other. It made her feel something that was close to inadequacy, which was a feeling she was not accustomed to and did not entirely know what to do with. There's something else, she said. Okay. I want to offer you a consulting arrangement, not a position. I heard you on the position, a consulting arrangement, your terms, which means you work on your schedule and from wherever you want to work, and you come in when there's something that requires your specific expertise. She paused. We're going to be developing the next generation of the performance line in the next 2 years. I would rather have someone involved who actually understands the foundational architecture than spend another week the way we just spent this one. He looked at her for a long moment. What does that look like? Honest answer, I don't entirely know yet. We'd have to build it from scratch because I don't think the standard consulting frameworks fit what you do. She looked at him. I know that's probably not a compelling sell. It's honest, he said. I'll give you that. She waited. He looked at the sedan he'd been working on. A reflexive look, the kind you gave a half-finished job to remind yourself it was still there. I'd need to be able to say no, he said. If something's not workable with Nora's schedule, or if I've got a commitment here that I can't move, I need to be able to say no without it being a problem. Yes, she said, and I want to look at whatever agreement you put together before I sign anything, carefully. That's not even a condition, she said. That's just what you should do. The corner of his mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to one. Okay, he said. I'll look at what you put together. Victoria nodded. She felt something ease in her chest. Not triumph, not satisfaction exactly, but something in the neighborhood of things returning to a more correct arrangement. I'll have something drafted by Monday. She started toward the door and then stopped, because there was one more thing, and she had been circling it the whole morning. Ethan, she said, the invoice. He looked at her. $899, she said. We paid it, of course. But I want to say something about it. She stopped, finding the words. When you named that fee in the bay, and I laughed at it, I was communicating that your judgment about the value of your own work wasn't worth taking seriously. That was the actual insult, not the amount, the dismissal. She met his eyes. I want you to know I understand that now. Not because it makes it better, but because I think you deserve to know it was heard. He was quiet for a moment. The morning sun moved slightly through the bay doors, shifted some of the shadows on the floor. Yeah, he said. Thank you for saying it. That was all. No extended grace, no reassurance, no absolution delivered for her benefit. Just a plain acknowledgement, one person to another, that the thing she'd said had landed where it was meant to. She drove back to Sacramento with the windows down. But the investigation into Damien Cross took 11 days and generated documentation that Victoria read in pieces rather than all at once, the way you read something that's going to be difficult regardless of how you approach it. The findings were detailed and, in their own way, sad. Not the sadness of injustice exactly, but the sadness of watching a person make a series of choices that each made sense in the immediate term and collectively built something they eventually couldn't get out from under. The update to the sensor array had been deliberate. Legal was confident of that, confident enough to bring it to the board, confident enough that Damien's own counsel, when presented with the documentation, advised him not to contest the findings. There would be civil proceedings related to the IP question, which would take time to resolve. The criminal question was referred to outside counsel and would take longer. Victoria made one attempt to speak to Damien directly, a phone call his attorney ultimately advised him not to take. She wasn't entirely sure what she would have said anyway. The professional piece was handled. The human piece was harder to name, some version of, I knew you for 5 years, and I thought you were one thing, and it turned out you were another. And I'd like to understand how that happened, not to be angry about it, but because I think it matters to understand it. She never got to have that conversation. What she had instead was the work, the restabilized company, the 8 days of preparation that followed Ethan's repair, the board briefings and the investor calls and the media management, and the particular specific work of being the person whose name was on the door when things had gone wrong and now needed to demonstrate that she understood why and what she intended to do about it. She was good at that work. She had always been good at it, but she was doing it differently now, in ways that were subtle enough that most people probably didn't notice, though Marcus did. She saw him notice once, in a meeting where she stopped to listen to a junior engineer's concern longer than she would have in the past, and he looked at her with an expression she recognized as quiet approval. She didn't say anything about it. Some changes were better made than explained. 6 days before the unveiling, with the car in final pre-event preparation and the media schedule set and the investor communications drafted, she drove out to Roseville one more time. Not for business. Not with anything to negotiate or disclose or apologize for. She went because she wanted to. Ethan was outside when she arrived, the bay doors half up, a radio playing something she almost recognized from somewhere near the back of the garage. He was cleaning tools and laying them back in their places on the wallboard. A systematic, unhurried process, the kind of thing you did at the end of a day. He saw her car pull in and said nothing until she got out. Hey, he said. Hey, she said. She leaned against the side of her car and he leaned against the garage wall, and there was a particular quality to the quiet between them. Not awkward, not charged, just the kind of quiet that happened between people who had been through something together and were now on the other side of it. Nora made you something, he said. She looked at him. What? He disappeared inside for a moment and came back with a folded piece of paper. He handed it to her with the slightly self-conscious air of a parent conveying a child's gift to an adult. The look of someone who is aware the offering is small and also aware it's not, really. She unfolded it. It was a drawing. Crayon on construction paper, the bright deliberate colors of an 8-year-old working with intention. A car, clearly. Low to the ground, fast-looking even in crayon, with what appeared to be flames coming from the back of it in colors that graduated from yellow to orange to a deep red she'd pressed hard enough to crease the paper. Underneath it, in large print letters that were almost but not quite evenly spaced, "Your car is cool. Nora." Victoria looked at it for a moment. She was not a person who cried easily, and she didn't cry now, but something happened in her face that she didn't try to control. "She's never seen it," she said. "I described it to her," Ethan said. Apparently the description was enough. Victoria looked at the drawing for another moment. "She's got a good eye," she said. "The proportions are actually not bad." "Don't tell her that. She'll want to redesign it." Victoria laughed, a real one, surprised out of her. She folded the drawing carefully and put it in her jacket pocket. 6 days, she said. "I know." "Are you going to watch it, the unveiling?" He considered that. "I might watch the live stream," he said. "Nora will want to see the car. She's been asking about it since I told her what it sounded like." Victoria looked at him. "I could arrange passes," she said, "if you'd want to come in person." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him consider it, the particular way he considered things, without performing the consideration, just actually doing it. "I'll think about it," he said. "Okay." She pushed off from the car. The evening was coming in from the east, the light going golden and long the way California evenings did in autumn, making everything look slightly more significant than it was. She thought about saying something else and decided she'd said what she came to say, which was nothing in particular and somehow everything that was needed. "Ethan," she said. He looked at her. "The car really does sound incredible," she said. He looked at the garage, at the walls and the tools and the lift and the floor, and then at her. "Yeah," he said, "it does." The morning of the unveiling arrived gray, not dramatically gray, not the dark, theatrical overcast of a day that wants you to know something significant is happening. Just the ordinary gray of an early California morning that hadn't decided yet what it was going to be, the kind of sky that could go either way by 10 o'clock. Victoria stood at the window of her hotel room at 6:15 and looked at it and decided she didn't care about the weather, which was a sign that she was calmer than she'd been in 2 weeks. The venue was an event space 40 minutes outside Sacramento, a converted aircraft hangar that a production company had spent 3 weeks transforming into something that looked nothing like an aircraft hangar. Victoria had approved the design and concept and then stayed away from the build-out, because she had learned over the years that her tendency to have opinions about every visual decision slowed things down without reliably making them better. She trusted the team she'd hired. She let them work. The result, which she'd seen for the first time 2 days ago on a walkthrough, was extraordinary. A long central runway under track lighting that shifted color temperature, raised viewing platforms on both sides, and at the far end, behind a matte black curtain that ran floor to ceiling, the car. 400 seats. Every one of them filled with someone who had been waiting for this for months, who had traveled distances in some cases significant to be in the room. Media from 12 countries. The 3 institutional investors whose confidence in Ashford Motors had been quietly, carefully tended back from the edge during the past 2 weeks of crisis management. Industry people, design people, automotive journalists who had been writing about the project with increasing specificity as the event drew near. And somewhere in the right section of the general guest area, holding 2 passes Victoria had arranged through Renata on a Thursday afternoon while trying to appear casual about it, a 32-year-old mechanic from Roseville and his 8-year-old daughter. She hadn't confirmed they were coming. She'd sent the passes through Raymond Chu with a note that said only, "if you want to." She had not followed up because following up would have been the wrong move, and she was learning, slowly, to read the difference. She got dressed, drank a coffee that was considerably better than any she'd had in Ethan's back room, and went downstairs to do the work. The event had a scheduled start time of 10 o'clock, which meant the real start time was 10:14, which was close enough in Victoria's estimation that she allowed herself to feel good about it. She spent the first hour backstage, the backstage being a curtained area near the loading dock where the car sat with its own ring of soft light, already positioned on the reveal platform, its bodywork doing the color shift thing in the controlled lighting that had made her stop and just look at it the first time she'd seen it in the venue. She stood next to it now and put her hand on the hood, the way she had in the empty engineering bay 2 weeks ago. Different feeling this time, same car, same gesture, entirely different interior state. Marcus came back to find her there at 9:47. 13 minutes, he said. I know. Media's all in. The Bloomberg crew wants a one-on-one after the reveal. They can have 10 minutes. Investors are seated. Arthur's up front. A pause. You doing okay? She looked at him. Yeah, she said. I actually am. He nodded. He looked at the car. 8 days ago, I wasn't sure we were going to be standing here, he said. I know. 14 days ago, I thought we were finished. He said it plainly, without drama, the way Marcus said most things. I've been in this industry a long time, and I've never seen anything like what Ethan did in that bay. 17 minutes. He shook his head slightly. I keep coming back to it. 17 minutes. He knew what he was looking at, Victoria said. That's the whole thing, Marcus. He knew what he was looking at because he built the original. The rest of us were trying to solve the problem with the version we had, and he solved it with the version he came from. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Are they here? He and the kid? I don't know yet, she said. I didn't want to. She stopped. I didn't want to make it a thing. It should just be, if they're here, they're here. Marcus gave her a look that communicated, without words, that he thought this was more emotionally sophisticated than her normal operating mode and that he approved. 10 minutes, he said, and went back out front. Victoria stayed with the car for another few minutes alone. She had a speech to give. She'd written it herself, no communications team, which was unusual, and she'd written 5 versions before landing on the one that felt true. It was not a long speech. It was not particularly eloquent in the way that professionally written speeches were eloquent. It said what she meant to say in the order she meant to say it, and she had read it enough times that she wasn't worried about losing the thread. She was a little worried about the part near the end, not because she thought it was wrong, but because it was the kind of thing that was hard to say in public without it reading as performance, and she needed it to not read as performance. She needed it to land as what it was, which was a true thing she had learned at some cost and wanted to say out loud because she thought it mattered. She had decided to say it anyway. The reveal itself went the way well-executed events went. With a momentum that the preparation had built and the execution now sustained, the crowd finding its collective attention and holding it through the darkness and the music and the reveal of the car as the curtain dropped, and the sound that went through the room at that moment was the particular sound of people experiencing something they had anticipated for months, and finding the reality of it better than the anticipation. It was a good sound. Victoria heard it from the stage and felt it move through her in a way she wasn't going to try to describe to anyone. The car drove onto the floor under its own power, which had been a late addition to the program. Originally, it was going to be pushed out by stagehands, which was standard, but 3 days before the event, Victoria had quietly changed the plan. Let the car move, she'd said. Let people hear it start and hear it drive. Let it be a car. The sound of the engine in the space was different from the engineering bay. Bigger, more present, the acoustics of the hangar catching it and giving it back amplified. She heard people in the front rows react to it physically, a kind of collective lean forward, the instinctive response to something that moved through the air with that kind of authority. She gave the speech. She talked about the 4-year development process, the technical ambitions, the team, and she was specific about the team in a way her communications director had questioned during the draft review, because naming engineers in a reveal speech wasn't standard, but Victoria had kept it in because they had earned being named. She talked about what the car represented in terms of what Ashford Motors was building toward, and then she got to the part near the end. She paused there, a natural pause, not a performed one, the pause of someone finding the words they actually want rather than the ones that are ready. 2 weeks ago, she said, this car wouldn't start. The room went very still. She had their complete attention, which she'd had before, but differently now. I'm not going to tell you the technical details of why, because that's a longer story than this moment calls for. What I want to tell you is what happened while we were trying to fix it. She looked out at the room, the journalists, the investors, the industry people, the faces she recognized and the ones she didn't. We brought in an expert. He came to our facility wearing a work jacket, carrying a toolbox that had seen better years. He asked for his standard diagnostic fee, which was $899, and several of us, myself included, found that funny. A murmur in the room. Not quite laughter. Something more complicated. "We were wrong to," she said. "Not because his diagnosis turned out to be correct, although it did. Not because his expertise turned out to exceed that of our entire engineering division, although it did. We were wrong to laugh because we had already decided, in the 30 seconds after he walked through the door, that we knew what he was worth. We had looked at his jacket and his toolbox and the size of his business, and we had made a calculation before we had a single piece of actual information." She paused. "And the calculation was wrong." The room was quiet in a specific way. The quiet of people who are listening to something that is finding them somewhere real. "This car runs because of a man named Ethan Cole," she said. "He solved in 17 minutes a problem that cost this company $400,000 and 8 days of failure. He did it because he has foundational knowledge of the architecture inside this engine. Knowledge that is his in the most literal sense because he helped develop it. He charged us $899. That was his fee. That was what he asked for." She let that sit for a second. "The rest of what he gave us, the lesson, he gave us for free, which was generous, considering." She looked down at the car on the floor below the stage, its body catching the light the way it always did, shifting with the angles. "I built this company on the belief that what we build should be the best possible version of what it is," she said. "I still believe that. But I've learned recently that the standard applies to more than the engineering. It applies to how we treat people. It applies to whether we see them before we've decided we already know what they are." She paused one more time. "I want to be the kind of company, and honestly the kind of person, that earns the work they stand behind, that starts with not laughing at the wrong moments." She stepped back from the podium. The applause started in the front and moved back, and it was real. Not the polished automatic applause of an industry event, but something with feeling in it, which was what you got when you said a true thing in front of people who recognized it as true, because they'd had their own version of it. Victoria stood at the edge of the stage and listened to it and felt, for the first time in 2 weeks, like the weight had gone somewhere she could put it down. She found them during the reception. She wasn't looking, exactly. She was moving through the post-reveal crowd that had spread across the hangar floor, doing the work of talking to people. The investors first, then Arthur, then the Bloomberg journalist who got her 8 minutes instead of 10. She was 3 conversations into the reception circuit when she saw them near the viewing rail on the right platform, the section where the floor-level view of the car was best. Ethan was standing with his hands in the pockets of a jacket she hadn't seen before. Not a work jacket, but a regular jacket. The kind of thing a person wore when they wanted to look like they'd made an effort without looking like they were trying too hard. He was looking at the car on the floor below with an expression she recognized, the same one he'd had in the engineering bay the very first time she'd seen him, the expression she'd thought of as reading, the careful, particular attention of someone who was actually looking at something rather than just seeing it. Nora was beside him at the rail, both arms over it, leaning forward as far as physics and parental comfort permitted. She was wearing a bright red coat that was doing significant work in the context of the crowd. She had brown hair and her father's eyes, and she was talking. Victoria could see her mouth moving, a continuous commentary directed at the car below, and Ethan was responding in the way parents responded to an 8-year-old's continuous commentary, intermittently, with apparent genuine interest, without trying to manage the pace of it. Victoria crossed the floor and went up the side steps to the platform. Nora saw her first. Children often did, she'd noticed. They didn't have the trained social habit of pretending not to see people coming. "Are you the lady from the company?" Nora said. Ethan looked up. His expression did the thing it did. Measured, not surprised, present. "I'm Victoria," she said. "And yes, this is my company." "Your car is really loud," Nora said. "I felt it in my stomach when it started. Is that normal?" "For a car like this one, yes," Victoria said. "That's actually intentional." Nora considered this with the seriousness of someone updating a prior belief. "My dad said the engine sounded good when he fixed it. He doesn't usually say that. He usually says things like acceptable or well within spec." "Nora," Ethan said. "What? That's what you say?" It's fine, Victoria said, and looked at Ethan. You said it sounded good? I said it sounded good, he confirmed, with the faint expression of a man whose daughter has quoted him accurately and correctly in a context he had not anticipated. Victoria looked at the car on the floor below the rail, the same angle Ethan had been looking at it from when she'd arrived. From here, the bodywork color shift was more visible than from the stage, the way the lighting caught the panels at this elevation, making it look almost fluid. She understood, standing here, why he'd chosen this spot. I'm glad you came, she said. Nora wanted to see it, he said, which was true and also not entirely the whole answer, and she let both things be true without pressing on the second one. I drew you a picture, Nora said. My dad gave it to you. Did you get it? I did, Victoria said. I have it in my office. On the wall? Not yet. I'm going to frame it first. Nora evaluated this response and appeared to find it satisfactory. She turned back to the rail and resumed her commentary about the car, something involving a comparison to a car she'd seen in a video game that Victoria didn't catch fully, and Ethan leaned on the rail beside her, and the two of them looked at the hypercar on the floor below. And Victoria stood at the edge of that small scene and felt something she found difficult to categorize. Something about the particular shape of the two of them together. The way the kid leaned into her father's arm without noticing she was doing it, the way he shifted his weight slightly to accommodate it without breaking his attention from the car. It was the specific feeling of watching someone who had built their life correctly. Not perfectly. She wasn't thinking that, and she didn't think Ethan would have let anyone say it about him without correcting them, because correctness and perfection were different things, and he understood the difference better than most. He had made choices that had cost him. He had been treated in ways he hadn't deserved. There were years behind him that had been harder than they should have been, and probably years ahead that would be complicated by everything the investigation was now pulling into the light. His coffee was bad, and his garage floor was oil-stained, and his daughter had him carrying her backpack to the car because she wanted company on the walk. But he had built his life correctly, around the things that were actually worth building around. And watching him stand at that rail with his kid in her red coat, watching the car he'd saved run on the floor below, Victoria thought that was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the hardest kind of thing. Most people never got there. She excused herself after a few more minutes. There were people she still needed to speak to, and she was conscious of not turning their presence into an occasion, not making Ethan into a story she was telling at her own event. He wasn't there to be her lesson. He was there because his daughter wanted to see a car. She shook Ethan's hand before she left the platform. He shook it back. A plain, direct handshake, no performance in it. The consulting agreement, she said. My office is going to send something over next week, whenever you're ready to look at it. I'll look at it, he said. Okay. She started for the steps and then turned back. Ethan, the speech, I heard it, he said. She nodded. Was it okay, what I said? He thought about it for a second, actually thought about it, not performing the consideration. It was honest, he said. That's better than okay. She went back down to the floor and rejoined the event, and Ethan turned back to the rail, and Nora was already asking something else, and the car on the floor below caught the light and held it. In the weeks that followed, the world did the thing it did with events like the unveiling. It wrote about them, talked about them, moved on to the next thing, and then circled back with the longer-form takes, and the industry analyses, and the think pieces about what it all meant for the future of high-performance automotive design. The hypercar received the response Victoria had believed it deserved from the beginning. Serious, enthusiastic, occasionally rhapsodic in the way that automotive journalists could be when something genuinely earned it. Several of those pieces mentioned the story of the repair, not with full detail because Victoria had not made the full detail public, but in the way that things got out anyway, through the industry's particular network of people who knew people who'd been in the room. There was a brief flurry of attention on Ethan Cole that he handled, as far as Victoria could tell from a distance, by being entirely unavailable to it. No interviews. No social media. No response to the 2 journalist inquiries that reached him through the garage's general contact email. Just back to work. She found this neither surprising nor particularly admirable in a performed way. It was just him, doing what he did, which was his work and his life, and the distinction between what was other people's business and what was his. The legal proceedings related to Damian Cross moved through the process at the pace these things moved, which was not fast. His civil liability and the IP question was being negotiated through counsel on both sides. His criminal exposure in the matter of the deliberate software update was a separate track that would take longer. Victoria had submitted everything she had to both processes and stepped back from the day-to-day of it, because the day-to-day of legal proceedings was not somewhere she could afford to spend her attention when there was a company to run and a next-generation performance program to start building. She visited the garage twice in the month after the unveiling. Once for a formal meeting about the consulting framework, Ethan had read the agreement carefully, as promised, and had 3 specific questions that were all reasonable and 1 suggested modification that was also reasonable, and they had finalized it in about 40 minutes. And once for no formal reason, on a Tuesday afternoon when she happened to be in the area and the bay doors were open, and she stopped. That second visit was 15 minutes, mostly spent watching Ethan work on something with an engine laid out on a workbench, and mostly not talking. She handed him a coffee from a place she'd stopped at on the way, which she mentioned was probably better than his, and he said that was a low bar. And she said she was aware, and they stood in the bay for a while, and she watched him work, and it was the most peaceful 15 minutes she'd had in months. She didn't examine why. Some things were better used than understood. Nora Cole visited Ashford Motors on a Saturday in December, which was the day Ethan had agreed to do his first official consulting walkthrough of the new development facility. The space they'd designated for the next generation performance program, not yet populated with equipment, still mostly potential and empty floor. It was a weekend because Nora didn't have school, and Ethan came to the agreement that his daughter would not be left out of the things he did that were worth doing. Victoria had not expected to spend 45 minutes of the visit explaining automotive design to an 8-year-old who asked better questions than most adults she worked with, but she found herself doing exactly that, standing in the empty development space with Nora circling her like a satellite, asking about things like why the engine needed to be in the middle and whether the color shift paint was a special kind, and what happened if you drove the car in rain. The paint is a structural property of the carbon fiber weave, Victoria said. The angle of the light changes how the layers reflect. Nora thought about this. So it's not magic, it's physics. Most things that look like magic are physics. Nora looked at her father, who was standing near the far wall of the development space, looking at the infrastructure conduit runs with the particular expression he had when he was seeing something as what it was and also as what it could be. My dad says that too, she said. Mostly about engines. Victoria followed her gaze across the room to Ethan. He was making a note on a small pad he'd pulled from his jacket pocket. The same jacket from the unveiling. She recognized it. Something that had caught his attention in the infrastructure layout. Probably something about power routing or ventilation that she wouldn't have noticed at this stage, but that would matter 6 months from now when the equipment was going in. This was the thing about having him in the room that she had not fully anticipated. The quality of his attention. Not just to engines, though that was where it was sharpest and most specific, but to everything in the built environment he moved through. He noticed things the way people noticed them who had spent their working lives understanding that small things mattered and wrong small things became big problems. He noticed them and he wrote them down, and he didn't make a speech about it. He just handed you the note and let you figure out what to do with it. She thought she was going to find that useful for a long time. Nora drifted toward her father eventually, the way she always did. Not in a dependent way, but in the way of a child who has a strong gravitational center and returns to it naturally after excursions. She tucked herself under his arm while he was still writing and looked at what he was writing without being invited to, and he showed her without breaking the thought. What's that? She said. Ventilation run, he said. It's in the wrong place. Why is it wrong? Because heat goes up, and this is designed like heat goes sideways. Nora looked at the ceiling, working this out. So you have to fix it before the machines go in. Before the machines go in, he confirmed. Otherwise it'll be like the other car, she said, where something small was wrong and then everything else stopped working. Ethan looked at her. Something crossed his face that was brief and complicated. Pride in something more personal. The look of a parent who has been explaining the world to a small person for 8 years and is finding, with increasing frequency, that the small person has already got there. Yeah, he said, like that. Victoria stood across the development space and watched them. and thought about the particular chain of things that had led to this moment. The original work at Pellucid, the acquisition, the architecture that moved through corporate channels and ended up in an engine, the engine that failed, the laughter in a bay, the toolbox picked up and walked out, the bad coffee and the gravel lot, 17 minutes and a readout on a worn diagnostic device, a drawing in crayon of a car with flames, Nora's question in the empty room, the ventilation run that was in the wrong place. She thought about how each of those things was connected to the next, and how none of them had been inevitable, and how at multiple points in the chain, a single different decision by a single person would have sent everything in a different direction. Damien could have handled the Pellucid acquisition differently. Ethan could have fought harder, or fought differently, or not opened the garage. Raymond could have not called. She could have paid the $899 the first time, or she could have laughed and never gone back, or gone back and said the wrong thing in the wrong way. The chain had bent at each of those moments and then straightened and ended here, a December Saturday in an empty room, a father and his daughter looking at a ceiling, a ventilation run that was going to be moved before anything else went wrong. She didn't think of it as a happy ending exactly, because endings weren't the thing she had come to believe in. Endings were just places where you stopped telling the story. What actually existed was continuation, the next version of the work, the next problem to solve, the next thing that would reveal itself when you were deep enough into it to see clearly. But she thought it was a good place to be, Shaz. There was a thing she had learned, somewhere in the middle of all of it. Not a lesson she had arrived at cleanly or in one moment, but something that had assembled itself gradually out of the gravel lot, and the bad coffee, and the engineering bay, and the legal documents, and the speech, and the drawing pinned to the wall of her office in a frame she'd bought the week after the unveiling. The thing was this: the people who understood something deeply enough to fix it were not always the people who looked like they would. They were not always the people who arrived in the right car, or spoke with the right credentials, or commanded a room the way rooms expected to be commanded. Sometimes they arrived in a 15-year-old truck with a toolbox that had seen better days, and they charged a flat fee for their time, and they did not adjust their fee for the size of the room, or the cost of the car, or the number of people who laughed. And the cost of laughing at them, the real cost, not the dollars, not the timeline, not the damaged reputation, was the specific cost of being the person who had looked at something true and dismissed it because the packaging was wrong. That cost didn't go away when the problem got solved. It sat in you as a kind of permanent record of a moment when you had access to something valuable and chose instead to protect your sense of how things should look. She had paid that cost. She was paying it differently now. Not as a wound, but as a reference point, something she returned to when she felt the pull of the old habit, the quick read, the 30-second assessment, the laugh that wasn't really a laugh. It didn't make her a different person. She was still impatient in meetings that ran long. She still drove too fast on empty roads. She still had the reflex of judgment that came from years of needing to read situations fast, and she probably always would. But she had learned to pause at the edge of that reflex and ask what she was actually seeing versus what she was assuming she was seeing. And that pause, that small, specific hesitation, was worth more than she knew how to measure. Ethan Cole had not taught her that by intending to. He had taught it the way most real things got taught, which was by existing in a way that made the lesson impossible to avoid if you were paying even minimum attention. She paid attention now. The Hypercar sold every allocated unit in the first 72 hours of order availability. The waiting list ran to 14 months. The company's institutional investors completed their commitment with Ashford Motors 6 weeks after the unveiling, and the press release about it did not mention the 2 weeks of failure that had preceded the event, because that story was not theirs to tell. The consulting agreement between Ethan Cole and Ashford Motors ran to 4 pages and specified flexible hours, remote first engagement, and a clause that said explicitly that nothing in the agreement required Ethan to miss his daughter's school events, which was the clause he had added himself and which Victoria had signed without changing a word. He came into the development facility twice a month, usually on Thursdays when Nora had an after-school program that ran until 4. He stayed 2, sometimes 3 hours. He walked the space the way he walked everything, reading, attending, writing small notes on a pad he kept in his jacket pocket. He did not attend meetings unless there was a specific technical question the meeting required him to answer, because he and Victoria had agreed early on that his time was better spent with the actual systems than with the discussions about the actual systems. He was never late. He never charged anything other than his flat rate, which had gone up slightly, not because Victoria had pushed for a consulting premium, but because Renata had gently pointed out that the flat rate he charged at the garage was a garage rate, and the consulting agreement was a different context, and he had considered that and agreed. He still drove the same truck. Victoria knew this because she could see it from the second-floor window of the administrative building when he pulled into the visitor lot, and she noticed it every time in the way you notice things that were consistent in a world where a lot of things changed. It was the same dings in the bed, the same repaired chip in the windshield. She had thought once about whether he'd want a different vehicle now that the consulting arrangement was in place, and then she had understood that the truck was not a problem he was trying to solve. The drawing stayed on the wall, framed in simple black, hung at eye level beside the window that looked out over the Sacramento skyline, the crayon car with its colors graduating from yellow to deep red, the large, careful letters underneath. Your car is cool. Nora. Every person who came into her office for the first time looked at it. Some of them asked, and she told them, and they usually nodded in the way people nodded at a story that landed somewhere real. Some of them didn't ask, and those were usually the ones who looked at it the longest. She had been asked once by a journalist doing a profile whether she thought of the whole episode as a failure or a turning point. She had thought about that for a second, actually thought about it, and then said, I think it was both. The failure was real. The point was also real. You don't usually get one without the other. The journalist had written it down. She didn't know if it had made it into the piece. It hadn't mattered to her whether it did. What mattered was that it was true. And she knew it was true. And somewhere out past Roseville on a Thursday afternoon when the sun was going gold through the bay doors of a one-lift garage that smelled like oil and metal and bad coffee, a man who had every reason to be bitter about the shape his life had taken was instead doing work he was genuinely good at. For a daughter who already understood why the ventilation run was in the wrong place, in a life he had built, imperfectly, quietly, at real cost, around the things that were actually worth building around. That was the real story. Not the car, not the $899, not the 17 minutes. The real story was that some people knew what they were worth and did not negotiate it down for the comfort of rooms that hadn't figured it out yet. And if you were lucky, if you were paying attention at the right moment, if you were willing to drive 40 minutes on a Tuesday and drink bad coffee and hear something true, you got to learn that before it was too late to matter.